Go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this short lecture for Psychology, Abnormal Psychology, Psych 205, Professor Mitchell's Ivy Tech Valparaiso course. This lecture is going to be a very short one. We're going to discuss the Diathesis-Stress Model. I'm going into a little bit more depth than I normally do with this particular model because it incorporates a lot of the traditional models that we have, and it also is one of the models of abnormality that I think best explains mental illness in a functional way. It integrates the biological model, the cognitive model, the behavioral model, and the sociocultural model in a way that is applicable to almost any medical or mental health or social service profession. So let's break down what the diathesis-stress model really is. Essentially, this model views psychological disease, mental illness, as the result of interactions between a person's vulnerability for the disorder and the susceptibility that the individual possesses through their societal interactions. Okay, so that's a really fancy way of saying we all have a predisposition to certain diseases. We all have a vulnerability to depression. We all have a vulnerability to other mental illnesses. A lot of times people understand this best when I frame it in the world of addiction, that an individual may be more vulnerable to becoming an alcoholic than another person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will become an alcoholic. So there is no scale. There is no Likert scale. There is no thermometer I can put anywhere in your body that would say what your vulnerability is. But let's just use a 1 to 10 Likert scale, where 1 means you have very, very little vulnerability. And maybe there's never been a family member in your entire lineage that has suffered from chemical dependency. We'll just say alcoholism for now. And 10 would be biological mom, biological dad, both were active alcoholics, and maternal grandmother, maternal grandfather, fraternal grandmother and grandfather were both alcoholics. So you can see that there's like a very high heritability issue if alcoholism is something that can be inherited. So you would say that that vulnerability would be a 10. The vulnerability being, the diathesis being that if the genetic factors are really, really high and the environmental factors are also very, very high, the diathesis-stress model says that probably that individual is going to develop, it's going to take less environmental factors for that individual to develop alcoholism. Whereas somebody who has nobody in their family who's ever been an alcoholic, they're probably going to have a low genetic vulnerability to chemical dependency, but that doesn't mean that they have zero chance of getting it. It may take more environmental factors in order for it to happen, but it still can happen. So if you jump back into Psych 101 or maybe lifespan development, that term that kept coming up over and over, nature versus nurture, this really speaks to both of those. It speaks to the nature part, that some people are just born with a higher predisposition for certain issues, and some people, the environment will influence them in such a way that no matter what kind of genetics you have, the chemical dependency or the other mental health issue may become a problem. Okay, so this is one of several theories. It's not the only theory, but it's one of several theories used over the decades to try to understand and explain. I just created a new word, understand and explain the complexities of psychological illnesses, such as like schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, depression, chemical dependency. This model believes that people develop psychological disorders in response to stress that they have, plus the underlying predisposition to the disease. So there's two things going on here. The underlying vulnerability, that's the diathesis, comes from genetics, biological predisposition, things like that. And then the stress comes from environmental factors, such as who you hang out with, where you live, your socioeconomic status, factors that may come up in daily life that may be stressful. So in this theory, you can't just have predisposition, nor can you just have stress. Neither one of those two things individually will trigger the mental illness, Rather, stress triggers the diathesis, and both interact in some way to manifest the disease. Okay, so the example that I love to use in this situation, in this diathesis-stress model, is the brilliant mathematician John Nash. If you don't know who John Nash is, and it would stand to reason mathematicians aren't the most famous people in the world, you may know John because he was the character that was portrayed by Russell Crowe in the acclaimed movie A Beautiful Mind. A Brilliant Mind was actually a novel that was a relatively straightforward biography about John Nash that later became the movie A Beautiful Mind, and also there's a wonderful documentary called The Brilliant Madness. And each of those, the book, the documentary, and the movie, each look at different facets of what was going on. I would say that the book is probably the most accurate along with the documentary. As with all great biopic movies, there's some fudging going on in A Beautiful Mind, but they do it for artistic reasons and also because it has to be somewhat entertaining. But the reason that I bring John Nash up is because John had an incredible predisposition. If you look at his family, there was mental illness that was evident. So he had the diathesis for mental illness. But what the stress was he was one of the youngest mathematicians of the time. And this is a time when mathematicians were being pulled into think tanks and were instrumental in trying to help with wartime efforts. And at that time, he was in his early 20s working on his doctorate in mathematics. And, many students just don't like math. And after algebra, they never think about it again. But if you think about a doctorate in mathematics, they're going deep, deep, deep into single problems. And he was actually working for over a year on one single mathematics problem. And I want you to consider that the next time you're in Math 136 and you're 2 minutes into an algebra problem, you're like, screw it, I'm not going to do this anymore. I can't do this. Think about working on that one problem for a year, and there's no answer in the back of the book. So he works on this, and finally, after a very long time, he finally solves this incredibly difficult mathematics problem. And so again, this is the early 1900s, the early 20th century. What they don't have at that time is email. They don't have electronic sources. So he sends off his article and his proof to an academic journal to be reviewed. They review it. It takes quite a long time, a couple of months, because of the mail system going across the Atlantic and going across the Pacific, coming back and forth, being reviewed. Takes a while. He gets back information saying, congratulations, Mr. Nash, as you're now going to be Professor Nash or Dr. Nash. You did solve this problem. However, this problem was solved a couple of months before you sent yours in. We just didn't have time to publish it. Now imagine working on a problem for that long, thinking you had conquered it, and you had conquered it. He hadn't stolen somebody else's work. He had essentially just gotten the answer, started a little bit too late and got the answer a little bit too late, and somebody else kind of beat him to the punch. And it could have literally been John finished it sooner, but the other person handed it over and didn't have to go through the mail system. I mean, there's all these different things that could have happened, but consider that. Consider what kind of stress that would put on you, that you're not going to get the credit, because coming in second in a math race means you're not credited because you did it after somebody else, even though you both did it independently. This was the start for him of his stress. And he had stress before this, obviously, being a mathematician, but he suffered for the rest of his life with schizophrenia. That those stressful events added up to the point where he could no longer cope, and he started having auditory and visual hallucinations. Now, the beauty of his story, and I don't want to give away too much if you haven't watched the movies or read the book, but the beauty of his stories was that he suffered in and out of schizophrenia throughout his life because he actively decided at some points that he no longer wanted to receive treatment. And the reason for that was that because he attributed a lot of his mathematical ability to the different way of thinking that he went through with schizophrenia. One of his colleagues who talked about Nash after he had won his Nobel Prize in economics said, all other mathematicians would look at a math problem and climb the mountain trying to answer the question, and they would spend years climbing that mountain and finally get to the peak, and they would know the answer to the problem. Nash, on the other hand, would climb a different mountain and get to the top of that and look over at the mountain and see the answer. He would get it a completely different way, a completely unique way, but he would get the answer. And in math, that's kind of it's a special skill, because one of the things that most students hate about algebra is you can get the right answer but not show your work correctly, and so it's not correct. Well, if you are doing high-level math, there are multiple ways to get an answer, and sometimes that second way of getting an answer opens up a whole new window to the mathematics world. And so his mental illness was actually a form of blessing for him, because he saw mathematics in a different way. So getting back to the Diathesis-Stress Model, his predisposition didn't trigger the mental illness. The stress alone, there are mathematicians who spend their entire lives working on several problems and they never develop schizophrenia. So stress alone doesn't trigger mental illness. Rather, stress triggers the diathesis, and both interact in some way to manifest the disease state. The more vulnerable a person is and the lower his or her threshold, the less stress it takes to trigger the disorder. Okay, so for Nash, probably he was triggered well along, but he was in isolation, he was doing mathematics, he was kind of within his own head, so he may have triggered his schizophrenia long before he actually was seen as being schizophrenic, but it just wasn't noticed. So the Diathesis-Stress Model really, in my opinion, is a wonderful integration of the biological model, the cognitive model, the behavioral model, the socioeconomic model, the sociocultural model, even a little bit of the humanistic and positive model, because if there's nobody there to interact with in a positive way, you may never see the negative aspects of these vulnerabilities and these diatheses. So this is a short explanation of the Diathesis-Stress Model. By no stretch are you now an expert in this, but at least you have a good idea of how we can integrate some of those models into one larger model that tends to answer some of the questions of contradictions between, like, the biological model and the behavioral model, the biological model and the sociocultural model. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me or send me a message inside of the course room, and we will be discussing this. If you have any questions further, if anybody sends me a good question that I think would be a positive thing for everybody, I'll definitely bring it up during next lecture. So please feel free to email me. Otherwise, have a great week, and I'll be seeing you soon.